Oh,
What do you think? That's why I went.
yeah. That must mean that they had several applicants. Yeah.
Hey, we're sorry.
Mhm.
Well, always nice to
For you, my dear.
Right.
All things considered. Yeah.
You got one?
I talked to a friend in El Paso. And it's not even everything.
Hey, you're good. How are you?
Robert has potential lease listing or listing sale.
Oh, you got it.
That's in the 75252 area. 75252, just below, between George Bush and Frankfurt. Is that an area that we like? Oh, okay, so it's further north.
Yeah.
Okay. That'd be, yeah, because they're,
Here's something.
it's a lot.
Yeah, well, I know about this.
I got calls. So I'm like, do that.
So sorry you do. Because I'm gonna be out right now. And outside.
Very talented right now to get you. To get a lease.
I know. Play soccer. I never played soccer. Yeah.
Kill some more trees.
For me.
Right? Hey, how we do? How we doing? I'm looking so far, but we'll see.
Parts.
The chair here. Or- Right in my cup.
Okay.
I got it. The Zeus, do we need a microphone or something, or
Yeah,
we good
the microphones are,
up here? So we're good, okay.
yeah, it's not even, so you're good.
Perfect. Question?
Yeah.
Tell me your name. Shit. Nice to meet you. Good to be met. Thanks. And how did it get? We're happy to be met.
We're happy to be here with you.
Happy to be here with me too. Because we've all been in a class with an instructor who wasn't really all there. I haven't seen this. Make sure that fixed.
Check out.
You know, I was gonna get some water and I couldn't find it. I was drinking it, but I don't have.
Typically look like they're in the Caribbean. They know my person.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, my dad. We always go back about that. It's. You know, there was that technology. It's papers and rice.
Are y'all, so. I am going to do right now. Okay. So we got two at least. At least, and I don't get all the questions to ask.
Yes.
And, he said he thought they may possibly, to get me to find out, we've been trying to contact them for the last 2 months. And they got. But we understand and say, well, you can supply.
Right, let me have water here, because that's, you gotta have a water. Should help you again with the concept of this water thing. What's the point? There's no flavor to it. It's not fried. It's not.
8 glasses a day. Natural 8 glasses a day. No, that's not water.
Water in it.
Thank you very much for telling me. That's not him.
Are you two hooting here?
Yeah, that's the shirt. Or it's not. All right.
Okay, thank you for being here. Let me ask you a quick question. In the past, this has been a 1:30 to 3:30. It's a 1 to 3 today. Do you guys have any preference one way over the other?
I like one.
You like one better than 1:30? I'm glad, so you're here, so we're having a discussion,
Okay.
and I know that
Suits.
next month, Ann's gonna take over and kind of do the calendar. So let me see by raising hands, how many prefer the 1 to 3? Okay. So you see that, Suze? There seems to be a preference for the 1 to 3, so good job, girl. Changing the minds of the masses. So what do we do?
30 things. Why do you guys?
Okay, okay, so, we've got a supplement here. We also have another thing that's our top of the first page of offer evaluation. I'm gonna do that first, and then we'll go to the supplement and do that after some of the other.
I brought some snacks in the back if anybody needs snack or
Do you have a nutrition, a granola bar, anything like that?
nuts. Nuts?
Well,
No.
that's important.
It's really good. Right.
Okay, so total disruption. Everybody's working on food now, and you gotta get food.
I don't have any bars in there.
Okay, we're good. I'm fine. Okay, back to work. Okay, we're working on rebranding the class, and you kind of saw it in the text this morning. And we'll really begin to probably do it more aggressively next month to move from the focus being.
Of course.
Almost right, it's in that direction. So moving away from just the concept of just talking about contract to the whole transaction and what's going on. The key being whatever you guys are dealing with on a regular basis, we want to address. And, we've got in the other classes where we deal more with market and all those kind of things in our class that deals with trying to set up our education courses and all deal with all of that. Get one right up here. So the offer evaluation form, that first form you see there. This is a form that I used previously in a multiple offer class, and we'll probably in the future see if we need to do that again. The market has shifted enough that while we still have multiple offers, we don't have nearly as many as we had before. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when we get into some more of the conversation about the market. An offer evaluation is important, not just in a multiple offer, but in just one offer. So why would a seller need to be thinking about all this criteria and question like that if all they have is one offer? Why is it important for them to have some ability and their agent have some ability to help them evaluate? Well, I only got one offer, so what's the point here? Take it or don't take it on it. Is that how that works? No, it's not how that works. This is important when they only have one offer for them to have a really good process to evaluate that one offer. Because if they go ahead and say, well, that's all I've got, I might as well take it. And the next day, a perfect offer comes in. Well, why didn't you let me take that offer? I got this. How come I just took it and moved on? So every offer, there needs to be an evaluation process. And it talks about, the process there, and we've got 9 criteria, and then we have questions. And it's important to have a good sense, because this is an important part of your role as an agent, helping your seller have a process to evaluate an offer. And because a good buyer's agent knows that a good listing agent is going to have something like this, a buyer's agent needs to be aware of these same things. So when you're creating an offer, hey, these are the important things that a good seller and a listing agent are going to be looking at. So I need to make sure that we address that. So first concept is the buyer's lender. There's a unique challenge with the buyer's lender. Because nowhere in the contract or in the third-party finance system do we actually address the lender. We don't talk about who the lender is. Now, a good listing agent is going to have that conversation. A buyer's agent is going to say, lender, you need to reach out and talk to the listing agent, help them feel good about my buyer and all that. But who the buyer's lender is very, very important, at least at the beginning. What our challenge is that during the process of the transaction, we're seeing buyers, especially with this moving market, interest rate bouncing around, and fees, we're seeing buyers after they're in a contract, changing lenders. Unless they get the seller to agree to amend the contract and do dates or whatever, they're stuck with what they've got. They change lenders all day long, but they can't change the terms of the contract unless they get the seller to agree to do that. You work through that. So given that we know that the lender might change or shift, why is it important to you as a listing agent, your seller, to know who the lender is right up front? Why is that key? Yes, sir.
Sometimes different lending companies can be very slow or very fast in response.
Yeah.
And I've had that experience where they take forever to respond.
Yeah. And sometimes they don't respond at all. Yeah. One of the reasons that a listing agent reaches out to the lender, if the lender hadn't already reached out to the listing agent, is to see if there's going to be a good communication. Because right up front, when they should be selling you on the deal, if it's not good then, it's not going to get any better later. And so the experience you have right up front is really key as you work through the process. The other thing that kind of helps, if you've got a good conversation going with the buyer's lender, and that's helping everything move forward, particularly as you negotiate things in the contract, that tends to cause the buyer to stay with that lender and stop bouncing around. They'll feel a little bit more committed as they go through the process. So who the lender is really important. I was at an open house about a month ago, and with our agents, and there were a number of buyers there. They had a really good turnout, which they probably wouldn't have today, but they did about a month ago. And a buyer who was there who actually it was making an offer, it actually submitted an offer to them. And they were having a conversation with the listing agent about their lender. And it was one of the big banks. It was one of the big, Bank of America, Chase, where are those? And so I just walked in and I was there and I was kind of heard talking. And so the agent, okay, Bob, tell this buyer what you think about these big banks. Well, I'm not going to be critical, of a specific bank, because I may find out after the fact that they work for them or something like that, or, whatever. But I'm going to give her a sense of, here's our challenge. We don't have the best experience with the big banks. You don't often find yourself dealing with one person throughout the whole process. You're never sure who you're going to be talking to. If I've got a lender who's maybe not going to do everything in a timely manner or respond when we try to hit you, the big banks are some of the worst at that. In fact, some of them are so bad that we sometimes have buyers who end up in a contract and they work for one of those banks and they won't use them because they know how bad they are. But without me going through the whole process of, it's terrible, you don't deal with one of the banks or whatever. Said, here's what we really look for. We like to have a good local lender that we can have a conversation with. And sometimes push come to shove, you as an agent go to their place. You go and you walk in their door and say, here I am, and until we get something resolved, I'm not leaving. Having that ability to have that face-to-face conversation can really make a difference as you work through it. So who the buyer's lender is a significant factor, not just in a multiple offer, but in any offer. When the seller's in here looking, says, okay, what makes this a good offer? What makes this an offer that I really want to get into a contract with and not worry about waiting for the next best deal? And a lender is a big part of that. Does anybody have any input that they want to say, okay, yeah, it's exactly right. Here's why a lender is so key here. Yes, sir.
I think it was Lending Tree. Somebody tried to use them one time, and every time you call, you've got a completely different person. They have to go look at the file. And it's like, well, I can't find in the notes what they said last time. So our clients are really kind of getting not frustrated with us, but the whole.
Because they chose the lender.
Yeah.
And when you got a bad lender or a lender's not really working well with us, we hope our buyer chose that lender. So the buyer won't be blaming you. That's a good point.
So we changed them over to a local lender that you could go into, like you said, go in and.
Talk to them, get a deal done. Yep. Because that's key, because one of the terrible things that happens, and if you haven't had it, you will have it happen to you, is you're moving through the process and you may be well into the contract, middle of the contract, maybe a couple weeks before closing, and you reach out again to a lender. Lender says, I'm sorry, we don't have that file. We had it, 2 weeks ago, and they've removed it and they've gone to us, and that's a terrible way for you to find out they've changed lenders is who do you call? Oh, we don't have that anymore. Or it's people who say, who? What's their name again? Hey, George, we have a look. Don't have it. So that's not good. So that kind of situation is a real challenge. So the lender is a really important deal. Why is the title company important?
Can I,
Yes, I'm sorry, please, Sally. Yes.
you said I can change lenders, but not the terms of the contract.
Correct.
Does that mean they can't switch from cash to finance?
No.
Is that a term?
No, so it's a different conversation, but it's an important conversation. And it's a challenge because many times the seller will take an offer because it's a cash offer, or it's a conventional 20% down or 50% down. And then the buyer wants to switch to FHA or VA. There are two parts of this. One, the buyer can close with whatever lender they want to. They can start off with a cash contract and then switch to financing. However, they don't gain any of the contingencies that would be in financing. You have to remember at closing, it's all cash to the seller anyway. Doesn't matter where it came from. Provided it's not a little briefcase here with white dust on it. So what the second part of it is what the buyer's lender requires. If it's an FHA loan, the buyer's lender is going to require that inventory clause, that paragraph, that page that everybody has to sign off on. And so if the lender says to the buyer, yeah, we're new financing, you can approve and everything is good. The lender will say, however, if we're going to close this loan and fund it, we want the contract and addendums to be the same as promissory note, deed of trust, truth and lien. So the lender may say, we want all of these documents to see. So if the buyer's lender says, yeah, we've got to have these things, or we won't fund the loan, the buyer cannot require the seller to make those changes. And if the seller, work something out there, we talk about saying, hey, Ken, we don't work something out and the buyer doesn't close, they're likely to be in default. As a minimum, could lose your earnest money. But a buyer can close any way they want to. It's all going to come down to what their lender requires. Now, if it's still a good deal for the seller, it says, okay, I'll cash me in closing, I don't really care, and I'm still getting more than I thought I was going to get, and everything's fine. What can be done, what typically is done, is the seller says, okay, I'll agree to amend the contract at closing. I'll buy to close first. And then I know that once I sign off on the amendment, we get all what the lender requires, deal's done and I get my money. I'm not going to give up any other contingencies or anything else. I'm not going to do it now, because if I do it now, we're going to add third-party financing in them. We're going to make changes in the contract and the buyer picks up new contingencies, rights termination and all those things. So I'm not going to do that, but I'll do it at closing. And typically, in fact, I don't remember a seller who wasn't willing to do that at closing if it was still a good deal for them. And that's how you normally do it, because there's sometimes legitimate reasons for this to happen to the buyer after the fact. There's a tendency for sellers and listing agents to say, you know what, they never intended to pay cash. It was just a way to get into a contract. And so we tend to be a little cynical about it. And that may be the case, but it may not be the case. Now, it's less the situation today, but 6 months ago, what was the interest rate? 2.5?
2.5.
And so buyer enters into a cash contract, is having lunch with their attorney. And their attorney, and it's not so $800,000 deal, $800,000 cash deal. The attorney says, you did what? You're going to spend $800,000 in cash with interest rates of 2.5%? What, are you nuts? And so based on a conversation with his attorney, he said, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe I should change. So he may have a legitimate reason to make that change. And he may be able to make a good case with the seller, says, you know what, I want to change. It's not going to be 800,000 cash, but you know what, we'll put 40,000 down or 200,000, whatever. It's still going to be a good deal for the seller. And so sometimes there are valid reasons. Sometimes it's a credit situation that you move from conventional to FHA. So sometimes it's legitimate. But if you've got a buyer who wants to do that, you need to make sure you give the seller listening a really good ammunition to go through the process and do it. Because there's sometimes legitimate reasons. There's sometimes we'll talk at the class on the 20th this month. We'll get into the dirty tricks negotiation, and that's one of them. But it all gets down to intentions, what people have really intended to do, and you don't know. And I tell the story about one of our agents. Nice guy, super guy. When you start off talking really good about something, there's a butt coming. He's a great guy, but he's incredibly cynical. And he comes in and says, Bob, here's what they're doing. Says, I know what they're doing. How do you? Well, that's just how people are. It's just, he had the listing, and a buyer made an offer, and in HOA, so the buyer didn't check off A1, which is typical. They checked off A3. And he said, what are they trying to get away with here? So I said, let's look at A3 and let's go through the process. He said, well, that's actually good for my seller, isn't it? Well, yeah, it is. But he thought they were pulling something because he has this sense that people are, that's how people are. So that intention thing is a really hard deal to work through. So we got your question. I know you're stalling because you don't want to talk about the title company. Here's the title company issue. And it's interesting, we see people from other industries now trying to go to work for title companies because it's hard to work with lenders. People will change the lenders based on a fee of $25, $50, something like that. It's a hard sell. People don't care about your service. They just care about what the fees are. Title company is a service thing. So these people like Mary Mercury, who was with, American Home Shield for like 25 years, now works for a title company. Because the home warranty business has really tanked. Because of the nature of the market, I think it'll come back, but is that, and she said, I work for a title company because that's self-service and it's an easy thing. So title company, which is regulated in Texas in a way that's not regulated in all states, it's insurance in Texas. And the rates are significant, they're all there. What is different from one title company to the other is going to be the service level, it's going to be the communication.
Anybody need a copy?
Anybody need another copy? Is this of the supplement or the whole thing?
Okay.
Whole thing, okay.
No.
Okay. And so, when you're looking at an offer, if it's a title company you're not familiar with, you need to call them. I mean, you need to call the title company and say, my seller is considering an offer and buyers included you as the title company. And so I just wanted to touch base with you and see how you're doing and that's going and what's your process? How do you, because if it's a good title company, they want to do business with us. They want to, go through the process. All the major title companies are good title companies. You don't ever want to not do a deal just because it's Chicago as opposed to Allegiance, as opposed to Republic, as opposed to whatever, or your title. Because all the big title companies, they do a good job. Although you will find within major title companies, from one office to another, there's a significant difference. Republic Title right across from us does business in a different way than Republic Title in Frisco. Than Republic Title down in Dallas, 5 locations in Dallas. So, but having a conversation with the ones that make me really nervous are the attorney offices. The small offices, we're not sure that they're on top of everything. It's not as big a deal today as it used to be because there's all the software. We had a problem for a long time that the attorney officers really were not good at getting all the stuff recorded in public records so that we had the deed and everything taken care of. But otherwise, if it's a good major title company, don't ever let that be a deal breaker, but call the title company, find out who you're going to deal with, who you're going to work through and work through that. Yes, ma'am.
Why have the home warranty companies experienced a downturn?
Okay, so why have the home warranty company experienced a downturn? It's because sellers are no longer paying for it. Because what we'd had in the past, buyer had some good leverage and the buyer would negotiate a contract and 7H and have the seller pay for the home warranty. And so that was an audit. Now, we've made a mistake, by the way, by backing off. We should be paying, if the buyer won't do it, we should be paying for the home warranty. And they said, here's my closing gift for you. It's very important, and I know everybody's gonna have a different set of experiences about home warranty. Some had useless, waste time or whatever, and they do it in the past because there was somebody else paying for it. You ought to do it. In fact, in our E&O insurance, if you're an owner agent selling a property that you own, one of the requirements in our E&O is that you do a home warranty. And so I think doing a home warranty is a valuable thing to do. We should still be working on it, should be doing it. You should be talking to the people and making sure that it's good companies understand their situations, understand their pre-existing condition challenges and whatever their exclusions. But because we've got used to the fact that we should put in the contract, so we're going to pay for it. We did it all the time and we just handle it closing. And when that began to shift and change, it changed the home warranty industry significantly because they weren't paying more. So, it's dropped the business dramatically. Yeah. Okay. So title company, important, have that communication, make sure they work through it and understand which particular location that you're going to have this at work through. Number 3, the buyer's agent and their brokerage, who they're with. We've gotten lax on something. I need to probably send it out to you again. I've got a little document. It's called Bob Baker's Procedures. And it's if you call me or come by with a quick question, which never is, but that's okay. I'm what I'm there for. I've got certain requirements. If you're going to have a quick question, if it's something specific in a contract, you better have read it. Don't have a question that would be answered if you'd read that paragraph. Second is, I need to know who the buyer's agent is. I need to know who they're with. I need to know who the title company is, who the lender is. Now, why do I need to know those things when you're going to come in with a question?
Make a good decision with your answer.
Do what?
Make a good decision based on what your answer is, because you know the parties.
Well, that's part of it, the last part of it. I may know the people. And if it's a broker and an agent that I know well, we can probably handle the situation better than if I don't. There are actually, there's one, there's almost a second. That if I'm involved, it won't help. Relationship is so bad, actually, had litigation. The relationship is so bad that in putting me into it won't help. But if you happen to call me and we talk and you say, well, here's what I have, whoops, we got to get somebody else to help you. Just do it. I won't be the one to help. But most of the people, I know them, they know me, and, you know, we can have a good conversation, get things resolved. So it's important for me to know who they are. And by the way, it's important as you help a seller decide on an offer, your experience with a listing agent is huge. You're not going to be critical of agents. You know, that's a violation of Article 15 of the Code of Ethics. If you had a bad experience with an agent because they kept lying to you, to do what they said they were going to do and all this stuff, that's going to hurt the transaction. That's going to be a disadvantage for your seller. You need to know that. You know, and you're not ever going to say to yourself, well, you shouldn't take this offer because that agent's is a really bad guy. You're not going to do that. That's a violation of the Code of Ethics. But they have a right to benefit. So Marcia, what is Jana telling you?
She's telling me how great of a job you're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're the ones that have to meet with people on a regular basis, so.
So your client has a right to benefit from your set of experiences, but who that agent is on the other side is huge. You can tell a lot about an offer, by the way, and how well it's done. And if you got an offer that's done really poorly, that's a big red flag right at the beginning. You have to say, whoa, my gosh, it's going to be a hard transaction to move all the way to closing. They don't know what they're doing. And many times the agent, even the agent who's not writing a good offer, the problem is, I said, well, who's your broker? Well, they are the broker. Where do you go then? Not a lot of leverage, and not a lot of places to go as you work through. So when you have something, have a quick question, be prepared to, hey, here's who the agent is. Financial status of the buyer. What does that mean? Financial status of the buyer.
It can be approved for a loan or not.
Yeah, can they get whatever it is they need to buy your seller's house? You know, because your seller is going to enter a contract, take your house off the market. We want to know that this buyer has some ability to show up with that 800,000 or 200,000 or whatever it might be. And we understand the concepts of, you know, the lender, talking to lender, qualification for approval, all those wonderful things. Getting proof of funds. Proof of funds is a joke. Proof of funds doesn't really mean anything. There's no standard form. We don't know how current it is. Sometimes you don't even have a person's name on it. I mean, it's crazy. Question. Yeah.
Proof of funds. So how specific can we get when requesting proof of funds? So say someone brings me a cash offer and they send me a screenshot of like, you know, my buyer sent me this from their region app, right? And can I say, hey,
Okay, it's a great question. And here's your answer.
Yeah.
What does the seller want? How specific does the seller want this to be? So I said, okay, yeah, I see it says here they got 300 million in the bank. Wow. You might want to take it a little bit beyond that, but you're going to say to the seller, here's what we have. The seller says, well, you know, I'm kind of in that business and that doesn't mean a lot. And the reality is, regardless of how specific it gets, it really doesn't mean a lot because it's not part of the contract. It's not binding. If you've got a cash deal coming in, one of the things that your seller may consider is putting something in special provisions saying that they need a proof of funds from the buyer 5 days from the effective date of the contract. It's satisfactory to the seller, or the seller has rights of termination. This way, the seller's not hung out to dry. So it's in a contract, they get this proof of funds, and that's presuming you don't get a satisfactory proof of funds up front with the offer, which you would like to do. You prefer to have that. Yes, sir.
What is the difference between a conditional qualification letter and a pre-approval letter?
Okay, all the qualification is they've taken the information that the buyer has given them but they haven't confirmed anything. Pre-approval means they've actually pulled a credit report, they've actually talked to their employer, they've actually verified it. So they've gone through that process, so it's a more serious approval. You have to remember though, and while we want those are all good, the reality is they're worth a little bit more than the paper they're written on, but not a lot more. What's going to happen if you shift to another lender? What's going to happen if the buyer is great, glowing, got good credit, got good everything, and then he loses his job a week before closing? Or even worse, dies or something like that. But it's an important step. You're going to go through that process. One of the reasons you go through the process is it's an important due diligence, but it's also important for your seller to say you've done everything you can to help us move towards a good answer to the 9th criteria. Because what we want to do is go to that certainty of close. And having taken those steps with a lender is really important as you work through it. So that financial status, which gets into a little bit of the other thing that we're talking about, down payment, type of financing, what their situation is. Are they self-employed? Is one of the challenges they're going to be in a self-employed situation? Are they a doctor or a lawyer or something? One of those categories that get really easy financing. Janet?
So one of the great statuses is that they're already fully underwritten by the lender.
Yeah, and they can be fully underwritten so that all the lender's waiting on is a contract to identify the property. That's ideal. And that's a good conversation to have with seller says, and if the seller has any leverage in negotiating position, and say, here's what I need, here's what I require. Okay, I want fully underwritten, and I want that reflected in the third-party financing addendum, paragraph 2A on the second page. I want that box checked so that the contract is not subject to the buyer's approval. Because the buyer's already been approved, so we're not even going to give them that contingency. We still have to have the property approval, but buyer approval, that's taken care of. So when you go down that road and have a good lender who's done that, your seller is ahead of the game.
Are we allowed to make suggestions to a buyer, right? So if they come with one lender,
Who do you represent?
if we're the seller and we're saying, hey, we want.
You are the seller, or you represent the seller?
Or, well, I represent the seller, right? Can I, my client, say to the buyer agent and buyer, hey, we like your offer, but we want you to be fully underwritten. If your lender can't do it, here's a lender that can.
Okay, so
Connections.
you can do that through the agent, through the buyer's agent. A seller can even say to a buyer, you can use whoever you want, but I want a lender that I'm familiar with to approve it. The seller can say, you're going to go through an approval process with the lender I have comfort with. You can get a loan from whoever you want to. But I want to know that you're qualified, and I want a lender that I'm comfortable with to do that. So a seller can require it. All these things you're going to do is be a conversation that you and the seller are going to have and go through that process. That's going to be pretty key. But yeah, and the more you go through and understand that process and have those conversations with your seller, the better they're going to feel about how you understand the due diligence they're going to have to go through. Because in this market today, it's huge for the seller to enter into a contract and take your house off the market. So that deal falls apart and they're looking to have to get back on the market 2-3 weeks later. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. So getting this done now, make sure that you're in a good contract. As long as they understand, and this is part of the education and expectations, there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. I mean, contracts fall out every day for a lot of different reasons, sometimes legitimate reasons, sometimes not legitimate reasons. Anytime you're dealing with that whole group of investors out there, institutional investors, all those kind of people, and work through them, they've got a process they go through, and all of a sudden they discover that this property with all its parameters, it really meets their investment criteria, and they're gone. Yeah, you can keep that earnest money because we're moving on. And hopefully your seller hadn't had his house off the market too long. You work through it, so that becomes a challenge. So all these things come together on this financial status of the buyer. Because if they don't have a good financial situation, they're not going to be able to come bring money to closing, and your seller's house won't get sold. But it really is going to come down to that. We don't want the wishing and hoping. We want a buyer who's really able to close the deal, work through it. Now, number 5, completeness and correctness of the offer. And I kind of mentioned that earlier. How that offer is completed, how that offer is filled out is huge. If you represent buyers, well, make sure you get with Jana and Marcia and whoever your coach is, work with, and make sure your offer is done really well. Because a really good listing agent is going to use that as a criteria against you. I mean, sending an offer with blanks that are not filled in and wrong information, that's a huge challenge. So you need to make sure, and when you receive as a listing agent, when you receive that, that's a huge hit. Janet?
So listing agents will look at your license number to see how new you are. And they will take advantage of that.
That's true.
Well,
If you're less than a year in this office, all of your offers should be looked over by myself, any of the other coaches, Marcia, Jill even, before you send them in.
what tell Jill, you said, Jill, you.
You still be a coach.
Well, I know, I'm saying, but you said, well, push come to shove, you have to. Jill.
Well, that's not her
Well, you know what, if you really have to, you can go to mine. Well, probably should.
problem. Without nothing to recommend. You use those of us, that's our.
Now, you bring up a point. Here's something that you need to consider. Let's say you are a new agent, less than a year. By the way, when you do your first deals, this is not just a good idea, Trek requires it. Trek has in their rules, and when you do something for the first time, you have to have an experienced person. Trek requires it. But agents in this office doing their first deals, the fact that you got a license number say, yeah, it's very long, huh? Well, last week. Okay. If you write a great offer, they're gonna be impressed. You say, wow, new agent, but you really know what you're doing, don't you? I do. And you know what? You could know what you're doing too if you were with us. Just throwing all recruiting. But the reality is, yeah, because people do, they look at it. Now, I've got a little bit of a cynical view in this area. The more experienced your agent is, the less I feel comfortable. Some of them are just idiots. I mean, they really are. They rely on the fact, well, I've been doing this 20, 30 years. I really know myself. Well, no, you don't. You know, you've been doing it 26 years, you've been doing 1 year, 26 times. You didn't let anything new get in the way of what you thought you understood. So, so just the fact that they've got a license number almost as low as mine, won't be, but close. Doesn't mean they know what they're doing. Because, they may have just kind of casually been doing, like they may be in that mode now where they're doing occasion one for friends and family. They haven't done any serious business in 10 years.
So again, come to the coaches.
Yeah, go with the coaches.
Come to Marcia.
Yeah.
Let us help you.
Got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Talking about the correctness of the offer.
Yeah.
A lot of times these days, listing agents will put a document in MLS instructing a buyer's agent how to write a winning offer.
Yeah.
And they will specify the title company. They'll say you have to have an appraisal waiver. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think if the listing agent has the seller on board with that, and everybody just a listing agent, I don't know that. But if the seller says, yeah, especially if we feel like we're going to have a lot of offers, is, I want us to have some way to filter through all these lookers. So I want offers to be good, and here's some of the parameters that I want to deal with. That's okay, as long as the seller understands when you do this, you may have reduced the pool of buyers. You may run some buyers off. If it's not going to be a slam dunk line out the door of people who want to buy a house, seller may not want to do that. He may not want to push it so hard. We're finding some movement away from even preferred title companies, where we have that language. Because as the market shifts, we're seeing buyers and buyers agents being aware, you know what, that's kind of a RESPA violation because they're wanting my buyer to pay the title policy and that seller wants to choose the title company. That's a Section 9 RESPA violation. So we're beginning to see people back off from that a little bit. But I think the concept of here's what a good offer would be. I think it's valuable for a buyer to know that you're writing an offer. Here's what really works for the seller. And if you'll do these things, that'll improve your offer. And we'll talk a few minutes about that form, that invitation to submit new offer kind of thing that we can make use of. So I'm okay with that as long as the agent is on board. What I don't like is the agent who has that blanket, that kind of thing on all their listings. Because that shows that they haven't really had a conversation with their sellers. And you better look like, well, why would we tell you who's doing that?
We have a list. But...
So completeness, correctness of the offer. Terms of the offer. One of our great challenges in the market today it's becoming a little less because of the market. And that's the seller's lease-back. Because sellers are increasing, oh yeah, I gotta have lease-back, I'm gonna work through that, and I want it free and all that kind of stuff. People need to understand the risk of the lease-back. There's significant risk. Risk is greater for the buyer, the seller, but it's a risk for both sides. And it tends to be misunderstood. Paragraph 9 and paragraph 14 of the lease-back are misunderstood, how they interact with each other. Paragraph 14 basically says tenants are responsible for the property. If something goes wrong, something goes wrong for the tenant. Paragraph 9 deals with the ordinary wear and tear. We had this happen in this office, 20-year-old HAC. And during the lease-back, it stopped working. And the seller dug their heels in and says, no, it's not my responsibility. And I said, well, yeah, you are. It's no, paragraph 9, ordinary wear and tear. It was just an old unit. You knew it was an old unit. We disclosed it was an old unit. And your inspector said, well, it's working today. And just because it happened to go out during the term says, we're not going to replace it. And this became a battle between the buyer and the seller, which it always should be during a leaseback. We're not involved in that. As you go through that, the leaseback situation is a real challenge. So when you've got a situation where the seller is demanding a leaseback, the buyer agrees to do it and work that process, that may not be the best kind of situation, but the terms of the offer, all that come into play, and the seller can say, well, I want a lease back. I want them to pay for this, this, and this. One of the things that I don't see often enough is the seller ought to really be saying to the buyer is, the seller says, I do have an existing survey, but I'm not going to give it out. You need to get a new survey. Seller shouldn't be giving up existing surveys. I think people have liability when they do that. I think seller says, even if I have to negotiate that I'm going to pay for the survey, seller says, you know what, buyer, you need to get a new survey. You need it. Yes, ma'am.
Has that been a problem?
It has been a problem.
Like, what, 1 out of a million or what?
Well, it's not real common, but there's at least one case that went to the appellate level in which the seller was found liable. What are you saying? For giving up an existing survey. The things happened on it, and the buyer was able to hold the seller responsible because he said, and what the court ruled is the seller had in fact represented certain things by giving that survey, existing survey to the buyer. And the buyer did not do the amended, or where they amended, the seller, the title company sit behind the survey, and it came to a problem. Yes, ma'am.
Because the survey was inaccurate or because the things have changed?
It was wrong, yes. There were mistakes in it. And what the buyer alleges that the seller knew about it. And which is what's typical in a lawsuit is, hey, you knew this, you didn't disclose, you misrepresented, you failed to disclose, all those kind of things. The key is, and while it doesn't happen on a regular basis, the liability is there, potentially there. No reason for a seller to do that. If you don't have a good negotiating position, I can understand why a seller would do that. Buyer say, I want this survey, I'm going to save $400 or $500, and here's the deal. But I think if the seller has any kind of negotiating position at all, then they need to go through the process and say, buyer, you need a new survey, even if the seller has to pay for it. And I know I've got a bias about surveys. I do not like existing surveys on any level at all. I think you should always have a new survey because I have experienced over the years as I've bought sold properties, I have experienced survey problems. That's why I always have a new survey and I always amend the exception. So the title company stands behind mistakes on a survey. That's a bias on what I've done. Everybody's gonna have a different set of experiences you work through.
Excuse me.
Question.
Back to the lease back.
Yeah.
How did that turn out? The seller was.
Buyer and seller went to battle and they determined that it was cheaper to settle and split the expense than to go to litigation. It'd be more expensive to sue each other. It's almost always easier to settle than to go to, because attorney fees are just crazy.
Trust me, I know.
Yeah, so it's just like where they worked it out. And that's typically, what happens. We were able to keep out of the middle of it because if you get into the middle of something like that, they started looking to the deep pocket, which is a scenario, you work through.
So after a deal closes, what, is there any piece of it that we stay involved in? Like you said, we stay out of the.
Okay,
Lease-back.
so the question is, once we have a closing, is there anything we stay into? You stay into relationships. Because you don't want to abandon your client, but you don't have any authority. Like I says, you have no authority, contract's closed, it's over. And from that point forward, unless, and then it's the only exception, unless there's a lease back between the parties, this thing's done. You can't go back and amend a contract that's closed, it's done. And your only involvement after the fact, where we get involved, is when the buyer sues the seller after closing. And we've got the seller. The way we'll help the seller is any documents that we have in our possession that would be helpful to our seller, we'll provide them to them. We'll be willing to act as a conduit. Here's what the buyer sent, here's their demand, we're gonna send this over to you. But seller, this is a buyer-seller issue, this is between you guys. When you begin to insert yourself in the middle of it, set yourself up for part of the lawsuit. You just got to avoid doing that as you work through the process. Good with that?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Question.
So how do you affect the seller in terms of a lease back?
How do you do what?
How do you determine because net to the seller in terms of a lease?
What do you mean by net to the seller?
So, let's say you give a free lease back for a month, and how do you evaluate how much value you're giving? Does the seller's agent look at it differently, or is it expected?
So the question becomes, if you're representing the seller and your seller says, I want a lease back for 30 days and I want it free. So I'm not sure what your question is about that.
Because I really haven't represented many sellers. I've only been on the buyer side. And for the most part, at least for the past year and a half, I've seen everybody expect some sort of
Sure, somebody lease back.
2 to 4 week free lease.
Yeah.
So how does that affect like the seller in terms of net? Do they see like, oh, that's a 2, 3?
Well, it doesn't have anything to do with their net unless they're looking to a lease back to just give them more money. As you work through the scenario. But otherwise, it's just one of the things that here's what we want. Many times sellers ask for this because they say, well, yeah, I can ask for this. And I want this. Because remember, after closing, who's paying money? Who's paying who? We got a tenant. That's the seller who did own the property. And they're saying the property, so they owe rent. And when do they pay it? At closing. And so if the seller has to pay some money to the buyer for this property, that's going to affect their net because that money is going to come out of their sales proceeds or whatever at closing. That's why sellers are wanting this for free. And the value to the buyer is they get the seller to accept their offer. You need a lease back? Sure. Okay, not a problem. No money out of my pocket. Are we good time wise? Yeah, he's back here looking at what. I always worry when you in class and look at what and start checking, see if it's still.
Everything. No, I still have coaching, questions that come in, so.
Oh, okay.
That's not-
We need to talk about.
Not this last one, I got it.
Okay.
When did the earnest money need to be turned in?
So, number 7, earnest money, option fee and option periods. How important is earnest money? Why is it important? What's the point?
Protection for your seller in case on the contract.
Okay, is it gonna be automatic and seller's gonna get the money? If there's any dispute, what's gonna happen? I'm gonna say till everybody signs a release, we've got it. And if you don't get this resolved pretty soon, we're gonna enter pleading with the courts. And nobody gets it. The legal fees will eat up the earnest money. Now, I understand the concept that there's that potential. So it says, and what seller really looks at the earnest money for is I want to see the intent of the buyer. If a buyer's gonna pay $100,000 cash for property, don't give me $500 earnest money.
Right.
Because what I really want to know about that $100,000 you're gonna pay me when it closes in 3 weeks, where's the money now? So I want to see something serious in earnest money. I want to see 20,000. I want to see that you put some serious money. I want to see that you're earnest, that you're serious about it. So it really is exactly what it says. It shows how earnest the buyer really is. We never want to go through the process. How you doing, Mr. Brody? We were just talking about you a few minutes ago about quick questions and we're good. So from that standpoint, now the buyer, when they look at it, before they decide to put a huge amount of earnest money up, they need to have the conversation with the listing agent, needs to have a good conversation with the seller, finding how important it is. Some says, you know what, I'll never get it anyway, I don't care. What the seller says, what I really care about is, that option fee. Give me $1,000 in an option fee. I don't worry about 10 or 20,000 nursing rate because I'll never see it anyway. An option fee, I want that, and I want that now, and I'll get that, and that'll be good. So you need to find out first money, option fee, what's really important to the seller, and have the buyer offer that up. The option period itself, we're seeing, and we still are seeing, even when as the market is shifting, shorter option periods. Now that can be a risk, and seller needs to understand. Don't make this so tight that a buyer can't really do their due diligence and have a property inspected and check things out. I think when you go anything less than 5 days, it's a real challenge. The buyer better already have their inspectors and all that stuff lined up, better be a property in really good condition. But the buyer needs to go through the process, inspection, electrical, HVAC, and roofer. You know, get it done in 5 days. It'll be more time. And seller needs to understand, it's a benefit clearly to the buyer, but it's a benefit to the seller to give that buyer that opportunity to go through their due diligence. And that's an important part of the option period. So it needs to be a good, reasonable, try to give them 7 days. You work good, and this is presuming the seller has got a good, strong leverage position. But as you work through the question, you're good? Yes, sir.
So I know that we're in a shift, so this might not stay popular right now. But I know towards the end of last year and beginning of this year, there were people that were doing waiving, right?
They were what?
That were waiving option period. So from the seller side, if that also gives them time to do their due diligence, is that truly a strength or something that we need to consider as a listing agent?
And this is where you're getting some of my bias. And understand some of my bias is a result of I deal with the lawsuits, track complaints, and disputes. I think it's a mistake to ever have a contract in this market without an option period. I think the buyer should have an option period. I am seeing, and it's coming from the listing agents, frankly. You're saying, you don't need it. I'm seeing it on land deals. Oh, there's no house inspect where you don't need it. Well, there's a lot of stuff that's been checked out on a land deal. I think it's a mistake, certainly a mistake for the listing agent to push zero option. I think we need to give that buyer some time to check things out. I think you really need to do it. If I were the listing agent transaction, I got an offer and there were 2 offers, one didn't have an option, the other. I don't see the one without an option as a better offer. Well, that's stronger. I said, what would be strong is if he's going to give me $1,000. That's what I really like. Give me $1,000. 5 days, 7 days, they have $1,000 for the honor of being in a contract. I don't like the zero option. I'm just really not a fan. Jenny?
But you still have a right to do an inspection.
Oh, you do an inspection, negotiate repairs. And here's the thing. Sellers look at this and they say, oh, that's a better offer. No option. Yeah, but it's manage your HOA. You didn't get seller disclosure to them. They got 3 other ways to terminate. It's silly for the seller not to take the money. That's free money. Yeah, give me $1,000 and I'm not giving up any additional rights of termination they didn't already have. But why not have it? There's no reason to not have it. Have it some reasonable time. I think it's a mistake to not have an option. And I own up to the fact that's a bias I have, but I'm absolutely correct. But in any market in today's world, in any market in Texas, because different states have a whole different version of this. Yeah.
I don't think it is now. I think it's always about options.
Yeah, I think, and I think certainly we saw this more when it was a really strong seller's market, where sellers, for whatever reason, listening said, yeah, we don't have to give up an option. You're not giving anything up. I mean, there are other contingencies in this deal. Take the money. Why not take the money? Just go through the process. Number 8 is net to the seller. Here's your big challenge for net to the seller. You got to understand this is an estimate, and we're relying on information from them. If there's financing involved and there's a payoff, this net can change dramatically. Because they may be totally wrong if they haven't gotten something from their lender on it. So that's what, and we've got all kinds of great programs out there. Well, the nets, top companies have it, lenders have it. So this is a good thing. But you absolutely level of expectations that seller needs to understand. This net, which whether we're required on the track rules to give a net to the seller on a listing you have on any offer they receive, so they'll know what they're doing. They need to understand how huge of an estimate this is. There's no guarantee here. Because if they see it as a guarantee and it turns out wrong, they're gonna look to you, to write the check. You work through it, so that's big. Question on that, before we go to the single one, most important one, certainty of close. Most important and the hardest to determine. Because you're gonna pull all these other things together to say this offer, whether it's just one offer, or one of 10 offers, is most likely gonna close. But you always have to say to the seller, you need to understand this could be the most qualified buyer, the best buyer loves the house the most. They're really gonna close, but things happen. And hopefully it never happens to you. It's happened to me. It's happened to other agents in this office. People die. We've had people die, have an accident on the way to closing. Now, and that's a tragedy, but there are things that have to be done. The contract doesn't automatically go away, by the way. You've got a stage, you've got people who have rights to buy and rights to sell. But things happen as you work through the process. But certainty of close is just critical. And you need to help your seller feel the best without any guarantees about this offer has more of the good things coming together, that it's more likely going to close. And I know some of you had this. This is the third in a row of good contracts your seller is in and buyers went away. And now the sellers are just gun shy. They say, man, none of it closes. What's the deal here? At some point in time, they begin to look at you and say, well, why are you not able to help me get into a contract with the buyers when actually close? What keeps going on here? But it happens. And sometimes it happens, you almost feel like this property is jinxed or something. But, it's just the nature of it. But certainty close is critical. Now, let's look at the questions that you've got to ask as the listing agent of all buyers. Not just some buyers. Why do you not ask it of just some buyers? Discrimination. Absolutely. You got to ask it of all buyers. Are they, and you can have it in a nice conversation. As you work through the process, it can just be a good conversation. I say, okay, I've got some questions here now. Take notes. First of all, is your buyer on offers and other properties? Why do we want to know that? Why is that important?
Likelihood they're gonna possibly get accepted with your offer, but
Yeah. There's like which one happens first. And they may or may not be committed to yours on any real level. So we want to know, are they in contract on other properties? And we had this happen a lot earlier in the year when we were in a more challenging market. Buyers are desperate to get into a contract, and any property they can get to a contract, whether it's the right property or not, they get into a contract. And so they were in multiple contracts. Also, have they terminated other contracts? We just had one, it's out of the Rockwall office, where, and the buyer discovered after, the seller discovered after the fact, we had the buyer, that this buyer had been looking for properties for about a year and had been in 3 contracts during that time frame and had terminated all of them. The seller didn't know it until they had terminated theirs. So they said, man, I wish I'd known they keep terminating contracts. Yes, ma'am.
So who's going to be answering this questions about the confidential information about their client? Who's going to be answering this question?
Or say that again.
Who's going to be answering this?
So you, the listing agent, are asking these questions of the buyer's agent. Now, she brings up a good point here. And let me give Janet credit, because every once in a while she does it. She comes up with a good point. Whether or not they have other offers and other properties is confidential. Do they have to give you that information? Certainly not without permission of their buyer. But you have to ask the question. You do know that when you ask the question, their answer is going to tell you. Unless they say, no. And there's no way to protect against the big lie. If I lie to you, that's, you know anything about that. But if they say, oh, I wouldn't have a buyer with offers on another, I wouldn't do that. Well, you just told me you are. And that's just how that is. So that's right. You are asking questions, confidential information. There are other offers, you don't know the contracts, they terminate the contract. It's like asking information, we have a deal fall through, there's an appraisal and didn't appraise out. The buyer wants to know, I don't know what that appraisal, that's confidential. You don't have to give up that appraisal information. But by asking the question, you're going to find out, you're going to get the information. And even though it's confidential, how they answer that question is going to really tell you as you go through that process. Right? I mean, you're going to ask the question. You understand why you're going to ask the question, right?
I'm not really concerned about that part. I'm concerned about whether or not anybody, if you're listening on the buyer side, is thinking you're giving them permission to answer questions that they.
No, okay. Does anybody think that because as a listing agent, you're asking these questions, that I'm giving you permission as you represent a buyer to give that answer? You never give information that's confidential to anyone other than a court of law, unless your buyer agrees to. A court of law, you always have to follow that, subpoenas. But you need to determine when you're having conversation with the other side, you need to get good at this. A good buyer's agent is going to know, if you know who the listing agent is, that's a really good listing agent. They're going to ask questions. And these are some of the questions they're going to ask. You need to have had that conversation with your buyer and have a good script on how you answer it. So maybe you can answer it without really answering. But I'm never give up that kind of information without having permission of your client, your buyer client, and you're going to have that permission in writing, such as an email. You're going to say, oh yeah. I just need for them to know they're in competition. They're not the only seller I'm trying to buy. I want them to know that. Yeah, tell them. That's good. Fine. They give you permission to do that. But I'm not telling you as a buyer's agent to give that information up unless you've talked to the seller. Or I'm telling you to talk to the buyer. You're absolutely correct. Now, the question of, do you have a house to sell? This gets passed over a lot. There's no obligation of the buyer to tell the seller they have a house to sell. Even if they have to sell the other house to buy your listing, they still don't have to tell you. They don't have to use the addendum. They don't have to make it part of the contract. And I will tell you, at least half the lenders out there don't make it part of their pre-qualification process. They don't even mention this is the source of the money. So you can't count on the lender having addressed that in their pre-qual letter. But you've got to know, but you've got to ask it. If they've got a house, because if they're putting a large down payment or even a cash deal, they may be getting that cash and sell their property. And you need to know that. So your seller needs to know that before they accept that offer and work through the process. If you don't ask them, they don't have to tell you. And many of them won't. You don't want to find out after the fact, after your seller's already accepted the offer and they're in a contract. That's the wrong time for you to find out. Well, did you ask them if they had a house to sell? Well, no, they would have told me if they had one. Really? This question, Sally.
What's a nice way to say, I can't tell you because my mother told me not to tell you. I mean, that's not the right answer.
Yeah, and it's a good question. What you're going to do, and you're going to address the confidentiality issue. You say, I know those are questions, they're legitimate questions. How do I want to know? But frankly, that's confidential information. I'd have to have approval from my buyer to answer that question.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
You move on. Why do we want to know if they visit the property? Number 5. Why do we want to know that? Yes, sir.
A lot of people just make offers.
Throw stuff up against the wall. Gee, I hope somebody is. Yeah. Now, what can happen if they've entered into a contract on a property they haven't seen, and the first time they see it is after they're in a contract? We have this will happen a lot with out-of-state buyers. If we get into a contract and then they finally for the first time see the property. And even with the technology we've got today with videos and all that stuff, it's not the same. It's just not, and you can't ever be their substitute. And yeah, I built the house and look good, feeling good, smells good, all that stuff. Your seller needs to know there's a risk for a buyer in a contract with the seller who hadn't seen the property. Because things could happen after the fact. So we want to know that. We want to know if they've ever seen the property, say work for you. But you've got to ask those questions in your offer evaluation involved. Now, you've got a form here, seller's invitation to submit a new offer. It's a text broker form, contract form. It's a great form. I really like it. It's not a counter offer. It says so on the form. It keeps your seller in control. And you can do this in any situation. This is a little bit, Marcia, kind of in a substitute for here are the offer and requirements. You've got an agent who's got a buyer and they're interested, you say, okay, yeah. Here's some things that are really important to my seller, a little less threatening. It's not here are your requirements. You already have an interest in it. Maybe you've already seen the property. And so you're right there, number two, seller may more favorably consider it. You put price in there and title company in there and terms and closing and all those things. This is a great form. And what will happen, if this may be the only offer, but if you use this, they're going to think they're in a multiple offer situation. Because that's when this is typically used. So they say, wow, without you having to fudge, you don't ever fudge, don't ever say you're in a multiple offer situation if you're not. You can't be the one that's like. But this is a really good form. I think, and certainly in a multiple offer situation, your seller may say, I got 5 offers and these all look good, but this would look better if, this would look better if. And when you send this out to all, you send out to all 5 buyers, it doesn't have to be the same thing. Each of these 2 different buyers can say different things because each buyer may have a different price point, a different something that they've got to need to change. So it can be different. But this is really, really good point. Questions on this? Yes, ma'am.
Me, ma'am?
Pardon
Me, ma'am?
me? Yes, ma'am.
So even if your buyer picks one of these and they do everything that's on here, we can explain to the buyer, it doesn't mean that they're gonna get the contract.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we have this conversation because what you're doing a lot, and you are, people in this room are, because you say, we can't let Bob sleep at night. We don't want him being relaxed at all. You're doing this back and forth on emails, driving me nuts, phone calls and texts, doing texting, and all of a sudden they'll say, well, yeah, I did everything your seller asked for. We must be in contract. No, you're not. But we still have people on a regular basis who believe that. I still get phone calls on this. So Mark's absolutely right. We use this form and we say these things. And the buyer does all those things back, sends an offer over, written offer, signed offer, that has all those things. The buyer may have improved their situation, but your buyer's got to understand this doesn't mean they have to accept it. So I say, well, yeah, it was good. A listing of 600,000. I said, I want at least 600,000. And you offer 600,000. You know what? That was pretty easy. I think I want 650. Seller can change your mind on any of this stuff. Send a new one. I say, okay, that was a good start. Let's do better.
Let's keep going.
Keep on going.
They can raise the price like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If the seller can change any of the terms, price, everything. Yes, sir.
So is this form a rejection of an offer, or are they no longer obligated to?
Okay, so good question. Buyer submits an offer. So you've got the offer, you submit it to your seller. And your seller uses this form. That is a rejection of the buyer's offer. The buyer's offer is now void, and the buyer no longer has any responsibility to your seller. So your seller needs to understand, anything less than a full acceptance of the buyer's offer, you may never see that buyer again. Now, that's not a reason in and of itself to accept an offer that's not acceptable. And by the way, same thing is true. When the seller makes a good counter offer back to the buyer, and the buyer in some way counters that, the seller is now free to go to someone else and just avoided the seller's counter offer. So that back and forth, one step at a time. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Now, you're not saying that this would take the place of whatever people are creating that says my seller would like these things in order to get into contract, like the full appraisal waiver, the title company.
So where are you communicating that other stuff? Where's that? Is your government?
In the transaction desk. You're not saying that this would take the place of that.
So are we in the offering process
Not
or in a contract?
I think she's talking about the offer guideline that y'all were talking about.
Are you talking about when a listing agent puts an MLS? Here's the offering reference here. Here's all the thing. I do think this can be used in place of that.
Okay. And
Yeah,
then the buyers-
because I think this is less threatening. I think this is the seller saying, yeah, here's some things I really like you to do. Because sometimes that stuff you put in MLS, frankly, kind of sounds a little pretentious. Here's the deal. I'm in control here. And it runs some buyers off. But by at least sending this over, you've made some response and say, hey, so now they've got some interaction rather than just that blank stuff in MLS. I think this could be used in place of that. I do.
We just have to make sure the seller understands
That what?
this offer make business, original offer's not gonna come back probably. In other words, they already told them, I'm not accepting your offer.
Yeah, when a seller sends this to a buyer, but they are saying to the buyer, I got your offer. Thank you very much for your interest. We're not accepting it. Here's some things I'd like you to change.
Right, instead of the seller saying, well, if they don't come back, for something, I'll still take that.
No, don't go down that road.
Cannot do that.
Yeah, well,
It's not a counter.
you got to, what we want,
They have to run it.
yeah, but what we're doing here is we're trying to encourage the buyer to keep moving, to keep working. And we're saying, thank you, got your offer and this is good, however. Michael?
How do you decide when to do this and when to just write a counter offer that then has?
Okay, so the question is, you do this or a counter offer, it depends on how many offers you have.
Okay.
If you've got 2 or 3 offers, remember, you can never counter on more than 1 offer.
True.
So you do this in place of that.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Absolutely.
Does the seller have to accept an offer? Or can they just hold on to it and decide, how long does the seller have?
Okay, so the question is, does the seller have to accept an offer, or can the seller just hold on to it and wait? And is there any timeline with sellers? The only timeline at all, first of all, seller does not accept, does not in Texas, does not have to accept any offer. In fact, in Texas, the seller does not have to even acknowledge the existence of an offer. And not required to, I got an offer, thank you very much. Not required to do anything. There is no specific timeline of how long a seller can hold on to an offer, but at some point in time, the courts rule there's a reasonable time. You know, seller, it's been a year. And the buyers moved on. Spoke to Atlanta or something like that, so either you can't come back and say, oh, yeah. Now, a buyer's agent will never let the buyer hang. They'll send over a release of offer, their withdrawal of offer. Because, you know, people do crazy things. Now, if it was a couple of weeks, I wouldn't let the buyer move on to something else if I had the buyer until I withdrew the offer. And I hope to do that in writing, and we've got a form and take road as a form. Anna?
So also when a buyer's agent puts this offer is only valid until X time, a seller cannot be required to perform by a certain time
So
on an offer.
when a buyer puts language in special provision that shouldn't be there, where the buyer says, you know, this offer, and depends on the language. They say this offer will be responded to by 5 p.m. On July the 8th. That language doesn't do anything. The buyer would have to say, this offer must be responded to by 5 p.m. July the 8th, or it is void.
Right.
If they have that additional language, then it kills that offer. That's a risk, because maybe the seller is a situation where they just couldn't get to it in time, and here it is 6 p.m. and they'll say, yeah, we like it, we're going to accept it. We can't accept it because it's void. No longer an offer, no longer a valid offer, and that's a problem. And I understand, I get it. I think it's a sign of being lazy. You can always withdraw an offer. If you say, well, you know, the reason we're doing that is we don't have to go back and worry about them accepting something, well, withdraw the offer. You got a buyer who's doing this because they're all making offers on the property. We're going to do this so we don't have to go back and withdraw. So we just put this in all of them. So we don't respond by such and such, it's void. And we'll, you know, say, well, you got to keep track of that, don't you? I think you just make a good offer, hope it gets accepted. And if the buyer's in a situation where they say, you know what, we're ready to move on, withdraw the offer. That's a simple email to the other side, get it done. To me, this is a sign of a lazy agent.
Again, I think the point needs to be a seller cannot be required to respond to that.
Yeah,
They don't. want
seller doesn't require, you know, and it doesn't matter what they say in it. You know, if they say, oh, it's void, then it becomes void. Seller, the buyer says, you got to respond to it. So, nah, I don't think so. I got to get my nap in. I think I'm going to go to the movies, and I got to have lunch. And not true of all states, but in Texas, seller is not required to even acknowledge the existence of an offer. Not required to do anything. And they're not required to accept full price offers. They get an offer at full price and they say, well, that was good. That was easy. I want more. We get to do that. There's no limit to what they can do in the situation. Good with that?
So the buyer that makes the offer, they're on the hook until they terminate that.
Until they withdraw it. Withdraw it. Yeah, correct answer. So when a buyer makes an offer, that offer is live and active and ready to become a contract until the buyer withdraws it. And the timing is important. The buyer has to withdraw that offer before the listing agent or seller communicates to the buyer, my seller has accepted, has signed off on, we have an executed contract. The buyer, if the seller communicates that before the buyer withdraws it, it's buyer's in contract. So the timing of that becomes important. So the buyer is on the hook. Same thing, seller's on the hook with the counter offer until it's accepted, rejected, or whatever, or until they withdraw it. In the same form we use to withdraw an offer, we also in the same form withdraw a counter offer. Yes, ma'am.
What about communication of a termination, the buyer?
Termination of what?
You're under contract and you have a listing and the buyer says, the buyer's agent says their client intends to terminate the contract, but they haven't sent you anything. They haven't title anything.
Yeah, we have some real challenges with the communications that are not making use of the correct promulgated form. There's a correct promulgated form, notice termination contract by buyer. The agent is obligated to provide that to the buyer. The correct doesn't regulate principles. The buyer can just send an email to the seller or to the listing agent, hey, I'm going to terminate, that's it, and probably is valid. But there's always a room for some challenges with that. Needs to be done correctly. So if you're the listing agent and you get something from a buyer's agent, say, my buyer is going to terminate the contract, we're not having this, this, or this, and that's all you get, then you need to say to your seller says, I don't know if they've terminated it or not. You see some legal advice here. You need to follow up with the buyer's agent says, is your buyer terminating, or are you just thinking they might terminate, or is this just because an agent cannot terminate for a buyer?
Right.
Principal has to do it themselves. So you say, we need something in confirmation. Follow up.
So if you're in a backup,
Which are you, the buyer or the seller?
I'm the listing agent
Okay.
and
Your seller is in a backup contract with the second buyer.
we have a backup.
Yep.
And the first one says they're going to terminate.
Not enough.
And
Have to terminate.
we're waiting for the documentation. It isn't, all the verbal and all the text messages
Yeah.
don't matter.
And this is a real challenge. In fact, we've got this scenario in the new legal update class where it talks about where they had that conversation and then, but they weren't sure, they followed up and they had a backup. And unfortunately, the listing agent said to the buyer's agent on the backup says, you're in first position now because first, they didn't really have anything from the first contract saying they really had terminated. So now the seller's sitting there potentially with two primary contracts, two different buyers. You need to have something definitive that it really has terminated because those conversations cause people to believe things that are just not correct. It's real trouble.
And the title company's gonna require it in writing too, won't they? In order to release.
To address earnest money, sure, they're gonna want something by both parties. The only exception is, and this is not true of all title companies, if it's done during the option period, many title companies will accept that and only require the buyers sign off on it. It depends on the title company. Yes, ma'am.
So if the agent sends it in an email writing that if they want to terminate, is that acceptable or? They
No, it's not. Because an agent cannot terminate a contract for a principal. You don't have that authority in a special agent relationship. So that is just kind of a heads up to the listing agent. Hey, this thing's about to fall apart and buyer's going to terminate. And the listing agent then sends back to the buyer saying, okay, I need for you to send me the termination notice so I can provide it to the seller. And you want to do that as soon as possible. Unless you want to try to some way. We've just had, and this has begun to happen more often. Last day of the option period, buyer sends over an amendment and the termination of contract notice, both same email. Now, this is the problem. And it happens far more common than it should. The attorneys are very clear on what just happened, the contract terminated. And if the buyer and seller want to bring us back alive, they need to do a new contract. There's no legal ability to rescind a termination. because the contract no longer exists. It's gone. But this happens on a regular basis, and the buyer and seller kind of say, well, okay, let's see what we can work out. I have to go through this hassle, whole new thing. Let's just work it out. And earnest money's still there and we're good. That's a big legal risk. And they better be doing that under advice of counsel, not under advice of agent. Because that's a real challenge as you work through that. You good?
Last was.
Do what?
The last was.
Yeah, nobody's gonna show up and bring them back alive. One thing you got, the next thing in your packet is the internal listing site. We have in our office, and frankly, most other offices have something similar to this. Where you can offer up to a seller who may not want to have it fully on the market, and everybody treks through his house and just says, and one of your selling points is, you know what, we can keep this internal, keep it private, keep it just us. And, we're big enough, we got enough people out there. This is probably gonna be an investment property anyway. And our agent's got a lot of investors, so we're gonna keep it in-house. That's internal. One, you've got the advisory, first page, that explains to you, here's what it is, how this works. Second page, which is huge, critical. Nobody gets to see the property. Nobody gets information on the property until they have signed off on the certification. Because it's confidential. It's totally internal. So you can't do that. It's got to stay with us. You can't show the property to your client unless your client has signed off on this. Of course, there cannot be any public marketing, cannot be anything on social media about the property, can be no sign in the yard, nothing like that. And your seller needs to be advised, because the seller made a decision in the listing agreement, not going to put an MLS. And the seller in that same listing agreement, bold print, it says, yeah, I understand if something happens and accidentally gets publicly marketed, my broker has 1 business day to put an MLS. So you have to do that. This is a great additional thing to offer up for a seller who says, yeah, I want to do that. We've got some really aggressive, large real estate companies out there who really tout this. And what they do is they push, number one, here's something for a seller who wants us to stay in control of the property, but they also push it for their buyers. And we've got properties internally, we're the only ones that have them. So if you're a buyer client of ours, you get to see properties that nobody else gets to see. So this can be a plus. Now, it's a slippery slope. Gotta be very careful. It's so easy. Seller's guy having a barbecue. And they're there and somebody says, I thought you were gonna sell the house. Yeah, I am. I'm selling the house. In fact, I've got an agent selling the house. Now, we're kind of keeping it private, obviously you know about it. And then they tell somebody else and tell somebody else, and now it's on Facebook. Public marketing. So be very careful. You gotta do that.
So we have a system where we have a list of they used to be called hip pockets back years ago.
I still call them hip pockets now, off market listings.
But
we
is
have it,
there a list?
we have it on our private Facebook. Anna, Marcia, you gonna say something?
Facebook page.
Yes, on our private Facebook page.
No,
That's
but you
not public marketing if it's within a private, like.
It's on our private group. We're the only ones that have access to that. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a good additional service as long as you follow the rule. The third page here is a pre-market sales advisory. If the seller accepts an offer while they're in this situation, that's what we hope is going to happen. They get to accept an offer. We want them to complete this pre-market sale advisory notice, in which we basically say, you know what, you probably can get more if you fully put it on the market. This, however, may be the only offer you'll ever get anyway. So except that there may be a possibility that you're leaving money on the table. So they sign off on this, they acknowledge that that's in fact the case. And they need to, we weren't involved. Or as I know, it was a different offer in the KW office. Over in Fort Worth, where a seller discovered, because he sold it before when MLS, and one of his friends who had a house just like his sold their house for $20,000 more. And so the seller sued the broker saying, you know what? Thousands of damages the situation. You should have told me this more. work through that. And then the last form you've got in this is the seller's exclusive internal list advisory notice. Warns them, says, here's how this works, only available to our agents, our staff. And if something happens and you accidentally publicly market the same, here's what that's at. I'll go in my last one business day. Okay?
I know the answer, but you know, I like to ask questions. So. If somebody was getting some information, telling them that because Mike gets with Dallas Spencer Road and because you work over in Rockwall, that they could advertise to those agents. I'm like, I'll tell you that.
No. It's us. Not any other KW office, not anyone else. It's us. Every brokerage has a brokerage license number. I mean, just because I'm the managing broker here, I'm not the broker of record, but even if I was the broker of record here and the broker of record in Rockwall, each of those has a corporate license number that all the licenses are under. You have no intermediary. Even in the Go offices, you know, the Smoky Garrett and David Osborne offices, you know, that has one broker over like 8 offices. Every one of those offices has a separate, different corporate broker's license. There's no intermediary between those. There's no intermediary here. And you don't get to go down and tell somebody, tell them it's Preston, oh, here's a free listing, you ought to know about that. And here's your KW, it's okay. It's not, gotta be our office. And gotta stay totally with us.
I asked that question to Terry at, Smith, is it Smith, at CCAR? And he said, when I was asking the question about marketing and what office, and he said, are you in Bob Baker's office? And I said, yes. He said, well, Bob Baker is also over Rockwall. He said, so that means you can market to the Rockwall office.
I'm glad to know that. I'm
You
speaking
need
to
to probably
you about
need to,
that.
you need to ask him
You
about it,
know, that's not the case.
but that's
Yep,
what he
you're
said.
exactly right. So I'm glad, you know, and
And I don't think every agent that has an off market is aware of the procedures.
In fact, I know.
I'm sorry, you say what?
I don't think every.
Oh,
agent-
you have, that's one of the reasons I'm trying to talk about here. Because we discovered after the fact, because I talked about this months ago. There were people in the class, you know, and people all that kind of stuff. And we discovered, and Marcia and Janet pointed out, I said, Bob, how come nobody knows about this? You're not explaining it right, Bob. I understand that's, you know, it's all my fault. But the reality is, this is one of those things that we have to be reminded of. Because frankly, for most of us, you're not going to make use of it. It takes a special seller situation to make use of it. Yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to deal with it that way. So we do need to constantly remind people about that. We're probably going to try to go through and begin to do a series of videos. People seem to pay attention to videos that cover everything in this, and I'll cover intermediary and some other things. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
I think it's very hard. Like I find myself hesitant to even call somebody. They asked off the neighbors and all I said was, do you know anybody who might want to move to this neighborhood? Because I'm not going to say anything else.
No.
It's really hard when we were there. The neighbor sees that there's a bunch of cars out front and don't you think they're going to say to somebody, hey, why are y'all here? Hello, watch what you say.
Because they're going to provide a free lunch.
Yeah, but I think it's.
You're right. It is hard to not find yourself saying things that really are going to constitute public marketing. You have to really be careful as you work through that. You're absolutely correct. But the parameters of this, which are NAR parameters under the clear cooperation, are pretty tight. You really got to follow, be very careful you're making use of it. We go with the internal marketing, which we probably will visit more and more again because you have to be reminded of it. Because what will happen, and we understand that's the way it works. So yeah, wow, that's interesting. And then 2 weeks later, you actually have one. Bob, let's talk about that one more time. What were those rules again? Do you have anything in writing? Because this is on our intranet, by the way. We have these forms, we have this on our intranet. So got that.
Where there are other situations, off-market properties, and the agent is not aware that they needed this.
So say again.
There's other off-market properties that are active right now that are off-market, and the agents are not aware that they need this.
What do you mean by off-market properties?
Off in the
She's saying
last.
that there are
They're
not
advertised.
MLS listings in our office.
Okay, then you need to have them call me because you can't do
Right. I'm just,
that. You can't do it. If you've got a property, you've got a listing agreement. it has to be an MLS unless you got this. You don't have any choice. You're in violation and hopefully, I mean, just my Rockwell office is under metric case. And their first level fine is $1,000. I've already had 3 agents over the last 2 years that have been hit with that. Because the competition finds out about it, and they turn you in. So, you had a question? We good? No? Second. Okay, we're good. So are we good with that? Kind of see, and it's a good service, it's a good situation, it's a good little quiver, and your quiver to, okay, here's something I can offer up. Just make sure you understand what it is and what the risk are as you work through it. You've got a model tenant criteria form here. So that if you list a property for lease, and boy, is the rental market going crazy out there, anymore. Cynthia is just, you're seeing some crazy stuff. Some lease amounts that may make it worth taking on a lease listing. This is a model tenant criteria form Texas Road has that we use. And it makes a specific reference to part of the Texas Property Code. The Texas Property Code from the Landlord and Tenant Section 92. And this is specific to 92.3515, which addresses the landlord's responsibility that if he takes application fee, what's the requirement here? And it also has a list of criteria. These are suggested criteria. Your seller, your landlord may have different. You may have more. You just need to make sure they don't have any that touch on the protected classes as you work through it. And we're going through a process right now with Fair Housing Act and with HUD, Texas Department of Justice. Where in some areas, using criminal history as a criteria can become discrimination. So we have to be aware of different kinds of situations. We also have to recognize in certain areas, there are additional protected classes other than the 9 that we have under NAR. Austin, for example, college students who otherwise qualify, you can't discriminate against college students. They're a protected class in the city of Austin. Maybe in Denton, I don't know. Big university town. Often has it Denton. Okay, so have those kind of things. So these are things that still want. Now, you don't give this out unless they're request. If you have a request from a tenant, and it talks about this right here, and in the property code, that if you have a request, you primarily have this as a tool to help the seller make a decision on the criteria for accepting one tenant over another, but also as a defensive tool in case you complaints file. Say, well, here's the criteria that we have. Here's what we presented to them when they made the request. And so they know here's how we made the decision. Danny?
Are you saying, I'm sure I'm understanding you, are you saying that you don't have to provide a tenant selection criteria before you take their application fee?
You don't have to provide it until they request it.
If they don't request.
If they don't request it, you don't have to provide it. But if you take their application fee and you deny them, then you need to have a criteria list showing why they denied it.
You have to give them the criteria.
Yes.
Before they get you the fee, if you're going to deny them and then not get the money back, if you didn't tell them why.
Well, but you're not going to deny them until they've made an application and they're paid a fee. So when you have an application, you're going to get the fee with the application, aren't you? Not always.
About this too. I post a tenant criteria before they make the application, so it doesn't look like.
Well, the seller has a right to do that. Seller has a right to put in whatever format that you think is appropriate. So said, here's our criteria, so that some tenants who aren't even close to that won't waste their time with an application or trying to see the property or whatever. So seller says, here are the minimums. And the big minimum that I see sellers hitting are the income. Unless you see some others that are really.
It's criminal as it relates to safety and to financial. But if I was playing the devil's advocate, if I was a tenant and I made application and I got declined and it wasn't posted somewhere that I could go to immediately or ask my agent, I would be screaming, you don't like people that are purple, that's discrimination.
Well, we don't.
Why not?
I like Barney.
I love Barney.
So in regards to this, if you haven't had it posted beforehand, say you have 6 applications come in, right? And you get all of them going through the process, then you choose one. So can the simple, oh, why do we?
All of the other ones that you deny need the criteria list.
So what if they all meet criteria? You just pick.
You still have.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could have a tenant that fully qualifies.
Yeah.
That for a legitimate reason, the landlord should accept it. Because one of the things, and Cynthia does property management, there may be other people in a separate company that do it. No one in our office can do property management. You solve 99% of all your problems up front. And the landlord knows, you know, here's a person who on paper qualifies, you're a jerk. I've met them and they're just an absolute jerk. And it's not going to get better. They're not going to be less of a jerk later. They're going to be a problem tenant from day one. I don't want them in my house. And remember, the landlord has the right to decide who's going to live in his house, or her house. They've got the right to protect their property. And so they get to make that decision. Yeah, you got a question?
Well, I'm not really Christian, you know, I'm real big on words. It's the Texas Property Code, 92.3515 is a requirement that you provide it. They're just outs for the tenant if you don't provide it. So I don't think it's right to say, I feel like you're saying, you don't have to, you don't want to, but I'm saying A says you're required to do this, you should be doing it.
Well, upon request.
That means upon request.
You have to make it available. A copy of, you look at right there first thing, and the grounds for which a rental application may be denied.
This says.
While you do not have to provide a copy of the policy every time you receive an application, you are required to have a copy of it available in the event an applicant requests it.
And where's that word in the property code?
Right here.
Because I'm on A and it just says shall.
Well, do you not have the document in front of you? Do you not have the
Well, I'm
document?
looking at it on- It'd be different than the wording.
Well, this is the exact word I look for.
I think I'll look. Because it says shall.
But that criminal thing is not, yeah. Of course.
No, yeah, certain areas it absolutely is.
And one of this is-
Discriminating based on criminal history.
He doesn't say.
You mean right here where it says required you to make a move?
You see in that paragraph, where it talks about, you do not have to provide. Yeah, you do not have to provide a copy of the policy every time you receive an application. You are required to have a copy available in the event an applicant requested. See that?
Because I'm sorry, here where it says required, they got the rules.
Right under A and B. Question.
What is the best way, in your opinion, to decline someone based on their attitude?
Based on their attitude?
Yeah.
It's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer. I noticed that Cynthia left the room for that.
Maybe.
Yeah, but in fact, the reality is, you know, landlord will often make a decision just based on their personal gut feel about a particular house that otherwise qualifies. Where your challenge probably gets into play, and like get some input from Cynthia about this. If this jerk also happens to be a member of a protected class, how are you going to prove up the reason you didn't accept them is because they're a jerk, not because they're a jerk of a protected class? And that's going to be a hard case because one thing jerks know is if they push hard enough, they bully people into going and accepting their application because they don't want to fight the battle. And you know, they found out that the hobby is filing complaints. So work through that, but it's tough. It's not easy. Now, if it's not a member of a protected class, and while technically at some level, everybody is a member of a protected class, except for me, I'm just a good old white boy from West Texas. I got no rights at all, period, nothing.
There's protection against AIDS.
Hey, old people, go get a minute. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was going really well, they decided to bring up the age thing. Anna, do you want to talk about the age thing some?
I'd be glad to talk about the age.
Yeah, I got
So to Sally's question, if there are criteria where criminal background does have to be, cannot be discriminated against, how do we know where those areas are? Is there?
We don't. That's gonna be a landlord conversation. The landlord's got to make that decision as you work through it. What the reason that this comes up at all, and this comes out of Department of Justice, HUD, or housing, is they've determined that certain protected classes have a higher level of criminal activity. And so when you begin to use criminal history as a primary criteria, you're kind of discriminating against people in that particular class. And that's the basis for why you do it. It's not automatic. It doesn't mean that when you use that, you're automatically discriminating. You have all the other bases, but it's something that they really are treating seriously. And this is really more a Department of Justice kind of thing, which rules over the HUD and the fair housing. It goes against the basic of, well, I don't want bad people in my house. And you have a right to not have bad people in your house, but it's just like same challenge that Trek has it when they're going to deny an applicant for a license because they had some felony or something in the past. What they're required now to do is prove up that it relates to your duties as a license holder. That if it has nothing to do with how you perform as a license holder, you can't deny it because of that. And that was an act of the state legislature said, Trek, you can't be doing that. You've got to prove up that whatever this thing is that they've done is going to impact on their ability to take care of the public with their license. Yes, ma'am.
In reading about some of that, what I read was that they were wanting to get away from people just get across the board. Oh, you had a misdemeanor, you had, a small felony when you were 12 and now you're 52 and had, a stellar record. It was just across the board. But if you had specific criteria, specific things that were of concern, those things could be,
it really gets more into the felonies, which create some type of a safety issue. People, for example, DUIs, one of the really big things that just kills an applicant is if they were involved in the manufacture of illegal drugs, manufacturing and distribution, not just the use of. There's a lot of flexibility on the use of how much, what the time frame was. If you did it when you were 18 years old, as opposed to, since then you've done it 5 or 6 times. Last time was last week. But you're right. Trying to get away from that. And they're really having to prove up the relationship. There's a relationship between what they've done and why we disqualify them for whatever. Work through that. So we good with that?
No, I'm still confused.
About what?
Okay, so people that have a criminal history are not a protected class now, or they
Or
are?
not.
They are
Just
not.
because you have a criminal history, that's not a protected class. However, there's a potential for discrimination when you use that as a criteria. I know it's right there. That's what I'm saying. When you use criminal history as a criteria, there's a potential for discrimination. Because if they find that you have used that against everyone in a protected class or whatever, and certain protected classes have a much higher level of criminal activity. If you're using that as criteria, you automatically discriminate against all people in that protected class, whatever that might be. So one, it's not a protected class, but if you use it in a way that may become discriminatory, that's a judgment call. That's going to take someone filing a complaint. That's going to take somebody that's going to take the court, going through the process and saying, well, as we look at your history and what you've done. But if the landlord accommodates, does reasonable accommodation as you go through the process, then it may not be the case. We just know because of the direction the Department of Justice is going and dealing with this, that it can become a discrimination. Yes, ma'am.
If you have a tenant criteria and it says on there, any kind of criminal conviction regardless of type, that's a blanket policy.
That's kind of broad.
And that would be discrimination. Okay.
Okay, so let's clarify something. It could be. What you really have to understand, this is complicated enough because you've got the government involved at multiple levels, that all you can do is have your client, your landlord, be consistent They go through the process and not find that this criteria hits some classes more than other classes, which then could create a potential complaint. You can't say, well, that will or that will not. You say it could be, it's possible, it could be discrimination. What you've got to have them do is, you know what, you may want to talk to the attorney on this as you work through that process. It's a very tricky balance because on the one hand, a property owner has the right to determine who's going to live in their house. At the same time, under Fair Housing, under HUD and Department of Justice, they're very aggressive on the rights of people to be able to live in other people's houses. And, you know, they have a right to live in your house. Say, well, can we work out a balance here about how much protection I can have? Say, well, as long as it doesn't infringe on their rights, whatever that might be. It's not an easy thing, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get harder. One of the things that we know very aggressively because of the way the rental market is going, more affordability issues. We're going to find whole groups that are just totally eliminated from certain areas. And then we're going through the process right now. There's like one down in the Dallas area where they're filing action against the city council for their zoning and permitting rules that keep Section 8 and keep certain types of housing, affordable housing to be in certain areas. And so that's going to go through the courts. And so we're seeing that more and more because the whole affordability issue is going to be a real challenge to work through this. You know, it's not easy. And that's why we pay you the big bucks. So you can handle stuff. It's not easy to work through it.
You know, I honestly have just recently had this experience. That's why I'm asking you this. Because we had the owner of the property and I was leasing.
Okay.
And it was 2 felons that applied.
What?
Felons.
Okay. 2 felons?
Yeah. For methamphetamines.
Okay.
One was for distribution and manufacture, and the other one was just.
So one was making it for the other. I don't want a friend for, right?
That's how I don't know what about this topic. Oh, and that's it. Anyway, here's what happened. The agent called me and said,
The tenant's agent?
the tenant's agent called me and said, I do this tenant and his roommate, and they do have a felony, they are felons. They have felony conviction and but they're out of prison. One's been out 2 years.
I got out just last week, so what's their income level? Well, from selling the drugs.
Yeah.
Well, they're all world different. I just said, and I said, well, thank you for calling first. You know, we already have 8 to 10 applications. And my landlord's already working one of them, but if you want to go ahead and send them in, it's fine. I'll present them.
Well, you have to present.
No, I won't bother. I've already gone through this so many times with other rental.
Okay.
In all seriousness, too, do help people find housing. Where do such people find?
But I didn't say.
And we do what?
Yeah, it's like, where do they find housing? Like,
Yeah, rundown apartments in certain areas of town.
Here's Middler for apartments down.
So we're not going to get to this, which is the only reason that Marcia sent through my class. Bob, are you going to cover this?
oh,
So she'll be back on the 20th, because then we'll have more time. We'll start with this, go through it. So it's a great question. Now, and to kind of wrap this up, this is a huge part of real estate and of our life and everything we deal with. In my home, our oldest grandson lives with us. His mother and they live in McKinney, but Austin lives with us. He's 18. He has autism, but he's an incredibly cool guy. Sure. But I discovered they were having a serious conversation. It was getting around to affordability, and he kept talking about Europe handles this, we need more density and this, I thought, heck yeah. And we were talking about some of the things, and one of the statements he made that I didn't realize this. I knew he had listened to a lot of stuff and had some really interesting philosophies about things and got into the affordable housing kind of issue. And I said, well, certainly whoever the president is, should be able to take care of all that. He said, I can't tell you, Papa, how far left I am from the president. I'm way past where the president. I didn't know that about you. Now, he's even further left than my wife is. He's left. So myself and my two daughters are to the right, and this makes for a really interesting family. Thanksgiving's a really interesting time around our house. But they got into the affordable housing and they got into the challenges we're dealing with. And this is getting harder and harder. And the forces that are out there are going to create real challenges if the industry itself doesn't do something to begin to address it and deal with it. It's going to create some circumstances that's going to create some requirements, because we do have some challenges now, and it gets down to the politics of it, not the left or the right politics, but what the cities are doing in their zoning and in their permitting section as they make it almost impossible for the development of certain affordable houses in certain areas as they work through it. And somehow that's got to be addressed, because it will come back and bite us. Something that we as an industry learned back in the early 1900s. If you've got an industry that's making money and doing well, but it's not taking care of the public, you better clean your own house, or someone outside the industry, like the government, will come in and clean it up for you. If we don't figure out a way to resolve the affordability, the federal government's going to come in and step in and say, okay, here's how we're going to do this. And all of a sudden, we're going to have a whole different situation. Mobile homes are us. So I don't know, whatever the deal might be. But we've got to, not just for that, but it's the right, people need to have a place to live.
They work.
It's just, and then have it in a reasonable proximity where they work. Everybody can't live up in, Sherman Denison, way out in the country or something like that. We've got to figure out a way to do it. And it's just one of those things. Yes, ma'am.
In that note, I did go to the city council meeting, I guess last week or the week before, and they are considering whether or not they're going to allow short-term rentals too.
Sure. Yeah. And short-term rentals is a whole new conversation about it. And it gets down to their.
That's sorry, I said that wrong. Whether or not they're going to disallow them, they can't allow them, they can disallow them.
Yeah.
It's allowed.
So, okay, we're just about to wrap up, because you guys have done a great job. Yes, sir.
So just because we're on the topic of rental, how does the restriction on rental properties, whether it be HOA or the city or zoning, where do companies like Home Partners, Divvy, things like that fall in, where people are using it for purchasing a home, but in a long-term scale of renting in the short term for that period, so the house becomes a rental? How is that handled? Like HOA getting around that?
We can't be in an HOA that doesn't comply with the HOA rules for rentals. Because you don't have an owner occupant. So whatever their rules are there, you've got to comply. When Home Partners buys the property and they put their tenants in it who can be there, and then they can buy the property a year later, they still have to follow the HOA rules. Deal with it. And yeah, that happens a lot. It's a real challenge situation. Great questions, guys. You did super, super good. Thank you for being here. So be sure and bring that supplement that I gave you that talks about the expectation education. Can be a very important subject. We call this the Marshall Levine topic. We'll do that on the 20th when we have our next class. Thank you very much.
So just. Yeah. It's